The morning after the experiment, unmarked vehicles appeared outside the monitoring station. 3 men and 1 woman entered the building without presenting badges. Dr. Carr was still in the lab, cataloging the split sample when they arrived. They moved with quiet precision, collecting every recorder, hard drive, and notebook. One of them, gray suit, no name tag, simply said, "This material is being reassigned under federal directive. You'll be briefed." Merrow demanded identification. The woman in charge handed her a single-page stamped Department of Environmental Hazards, Div.9. The rest of the sheet was blacked out. Within an hour, the entire facility was cleared. The glass cylinder, the samples, even the protective gloves, all boxed, sealed, and loaded into a temperature-controlled van. The spiral residue left on the table was wiped with an unidentified solvent that smelled faintly of ozone. Carr signed the release form, his hand shaking. "We were just measuring sound," he said. The agent's reply was flat. "Sound is only what we can hear." They were told not to discuss their work, pending risk assessment. A non-disclosure contract arrived by courier that evening. When Merrow read the fine print, she found references to non-biological communication anomalies and mnemonic transmission vectors. She recognized none of the terminology, but one line stood out. In the event of direct contact, isolate subject and record all behavioral deviations within 72 hours. That night, Merrow returned to her apartment. The city felt unusually still. Every surface, desk, floor, even her own skin, seemed to hold a faint tremor. When she closed her eyes, she could almost hear it. 7 pulses, pause, 3. The next morning, she found an envelope slid beneath her door. Inside was a photo of the evidence container labeled X30. Beneath it, a single line typed in courier font. "Do not let them bury it again. There was no Zender." 3 days after the containment order, Detective Elaine Merrow drove north, alone. The roads were half frozen, silent, but for the hum of the tires. She carried one item, a copy of her field recorder, the only thing the agents had missed, a single reel of analog tape marked Test 3B. By dusk, she reached Clearfield County. The forest was bare now, branches black against a bruised sky. She parked where the old Cunningham homestead once stood. No buildings remained, only uneven ground and the slow pulse of wind through grass. Merrow set the recorder on the soil and pressed play. For a long moment, nothing. Then the tape gave a soft crackle, like static breathing. A faint rhythm emerged. 7 pulses, pause, 3. The ground trembled beneath her boots. She knelt, speaking into the microphone. "If you can hear me, what do you remember?" The sound deepened, shifting from vibration to tone, low and human-shaped. The air around her seemed to thicken, carrying warmth where the cold should have been. Then came words, not heard, but felt. Not buried, waiting. The soil moved. Not collapsing, not opening, but stirring, as if something beneath were listening, turning, learning how to respond. The tape spun faster, recording nothing visible, but when she replayed it seconds later, her own voice answered back, distorted, delayed, but undeniably hers. "We remember." Merrow stared at the recorder, then at the dark horizon. She understood then what Braddock had meant, what the spiral was trying to become. Memory wasn't confined to minds. It could root itself in matter, in the very earth, until the ground itself began to recall every touch, every loss, every sound. She placed the recorder down gently, pressed record one final time, and whispered, "You deserve to be heard." At 1942, the state seismic monitors registered a shallow vibration beneath Clearfield County, steady, rhythmic, lasting 7 seconds. The tape was recovered weeks later by a forestry crew. It contained no sound, only faint imprints across the magnetic strip, microscopic ridges identical to fingerprints. The official report concluded, "Unexplained subsurface acoustic event. No casualties. Case closed." But in the deep archives of Division 9, a classified memo dated 2 months later notes the formation of new resonant zones across 3 other counties, each aligned along the same pattern. 7 pulses. Pausa. 13 fanos. The ground, it seems, has begun to remember on its own. The births of the 3 sons, Josiah in 1848, Caleb in 1851, and Nehemiah in 1855, brought brief order to the Cunningham household. For the first time in its history, laughter was said to echo faintly from the windows of that lonely farmhouse. Martha, despite her fear of Silas, tried to give her sons what warmth she could in that cold and stifling home. But something in Silas changed after the last birth. Neighbors who encountered him in the following years described a man haunted, distracted, muttering to himself about sins of the blood and roots that feed on their own. He forbade Martha from attending church or visiting town without him, claiming outsiders were hungry for their shame. By 1858, Martha's health had begun to fail. She grew thin and pale, complaining of exhaustion and strange dreams. In her final letter to her sister, dated January 10th of that year, she wrote, "There are nights when Silas stands over the children as they sleep, not touching them, not speaking, just watching. I wake and find him staring at me as if he doesn't know who I am. The house feels wrong now. The air smells like the root cellar. I think the ground here remembers too much." 2 months later, she was dead. The doctor who examined her body could find no obvious cause, only wasting, weakness, and bruises along her arms that Silas claimed came from seizures. No inquest was ever held. Silas buried her behind the house near the stand of pines that bordered the creek. Her grave bore no marker. After Martha's death, the silence returned, thicker, heavier than before. The boys grew wild and strange. Without their mother's influence, they developed their own. When the farmers unearthed Silas Cunningham that March morning, they had no idea what kind of story they were digging up. The man they pulled from the soil was barely alive, hypothermic, delirious, his skin gray and cold as marble. His fingernails were torn down to the quick, his mouth packed with dirt from his own frantic breathing. He weighed less than 100 pounds. For nearly 3 days, Silas drifted between consciousness and fevered muttering in the home of Sheriff Elmer Trowbridge, who'd ordered him brought to town under guard. When he finally began to speak coherently, what he told them was so grotesque, so impossible, that the sheriff initially believed he was raving from trauma. But the evidence waiting back at the Cunningham farm told a different story. When deputies arrived to investigate, they found the house exactly as Silas had described, a place frozen in time, steeped in decay. The hearth still smoldered, as if the sons had cooked a meal only hours before abandoning it. Dishes lay washed and neatly stacked. 3 sets of boots by the door. The 4th, Silas's, missing. Then came the cellar. Deputy Frank Dobbins, the youngest of the search party, was the first to descend. He later testified that the smell hit him halfway down the ladder, something between spoiled meat and burnt hair. At the base of the stairs, the men found a scene so unsettling that Dobbins refused to return to the property afterward. The walls were covered with symbols drawn in charcoal and animal blood, crude circles intersected with crosses, spirals, and letters no one recognized. In the center of the floor was a wooden table, its surface scarred with knife marks and grooves darkened by old stains. On the table sat 3 objects: a rusted lantern, a Bible missing most of its pages, and a lock of human hair tied with twine. But it was what they found in the corner that ended any speculation about Silas's delirium. There, half buried beneath straw and sacks of grain, lay a shallow pit. Freshly dug, its soil still damp. Within it, investigators discovered what remained of small animal bones, dogs, cats, even birds, arranged in deliberate patterns. Some bore carvings on the bone itself. Primitive, geometric. The coroner later described it as ritualistic, but without purpose, as if imitation of a religion forgotten. The sons, however, were gone. Tracks in the snow suggested they'd left the property on foot, heading north toward the timberline. The sheriff organized a search party of 20 men who combed the woods for 3 days before discovering the first sign of the brothers. It was Caleb they found first, 2 miles from the farm, hanging from a tree branch by his own belt. The snow beneath him was stained with vomit. His neck had not fully broken, suggesting strangulation, not a quick death. His eyes were open. Josiah turned up the following morning, lying face down in a frozen creek, his hands clasped around something buried in the ice, a small wooden cross carved crudely by hand. But Nehemiah, the youngest, and by all accounts the ringleader, was never found. What Silas confessed in the following days filled over 40 handwritten pages of court testimony. He claimed that Nehemiah had spoken to something in the ground, a presence that answered when he prayed alone in the cellar, that he'd promised his father would feed the roots so the family could begin again cleansed. The court sealed the testimony in 1880 under order of the county magistrate, citing undue psychological distress to surviving relatives and irrelevance to any pending charges, since both Josiah and Caleb were deceased. The Cunningham farmhouse was burned down that same year by order of the sheriff, not to erase history, but to prevent trespassing. Still, locals say the ground never froze properly again where the house once stood, and that on cold March nights, when the soil is soft and wet, you can still hear something moving beneath it. Something clawing. Something that remembers being buried alive. In 1936, a renovation crew clearing an old agricultural warehouse near Frederick, Maryland, discovered a crate sealed with copper wire and stamped USDA property, "Do not open." Inside were 6 wax cylinder recordings and a bundle of handwritten field notes dated 1912 to 1913. The author's name, though partly smudged, was clear enough: E. Greaves. The cylinders were turned over to the Smithsonian for preservation. 3 were blank, too degraded to play, but the 4th produced sound. Not speech, not music, but a pattern of deep, rhythmic pulses, like air being drawn through hollow wood. Archivists assumed mechanical damage until the playback needle began picking up something else: faint, intermittent clicking, increasing in tempo until it formed a cadence almost like language. Then, halfway through the cylinder, came a voice: Eleanor Greaves herself. Her words were barely audible under the mechanical hiss. Beneath the strata, heat reesing, roots still moving, listening. The last phrase repeats 7 times before the recording ends in a sudden, heavy thud. For decades, the cylinder sat mislabeled in storage, catalogued simply as Soil Acoustics, Unidentified. It wasn't until 1974 that a graduate student at Johns Hopkins stumbled upon them while researching early field phonography. When she digitized the sound, she noticed a detail the 1930s playback machines couldn't capture. Underneath the surface noise, a second voice murmured in synchrony with Greaves's, perfectly echoing her final word every time she spoke it. She played it for her advisor, who reportedly said, "That's not an echo, that's a reply." The digitized file vanished from the university archive within the year. What remained were Greaves's notes, now brittle with age. In the margins of one page, she'd written a single line that scholars still argue over. The soil does not rot, it remembers. In 1944, while the world's attention was fixed on Europe and the Pacific, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began quietly mapping mineral deposits across the eastern states. The operation, though officially tied to steel production, had another purpose: to locate unstable subterranean anomalies that had interfered with radio communications since the 1930s. The first reports came from Pennsylvania, near the long-abandoned Cunningham Tract. Field scanners picked up faint, repeating distortions underground, massive voids spaced at perfect intervals, too symmetrical to be natural. The engineers compiled their readings into a classified document known later as the Hollow Map. It showed hundreds of circular depressions connected by thin, branching lines that reached all the way from western New York to the Carolinas. The formations formed a single continent-sized pattern, spiraling outward from one fixed point. That point was Clearfield County. When the first drafts of the map were shown to the War Department, the initial assumption was enemy sabotage, underground munitions tunnels, or geological interference caused by mining. But one analyst, Dr. Harold Fenwick, noted something stranger. The voids were slowly shifting. Each time they remeasured, the circles had moved a few meters east, as if migrating, an invisible migration beneath the continental crust. The discovery was classified under acoustic geothermal studies, then buried under Cold War secrecy. Fenwick was reassigned 6 months later, his credentials revoked after he began writing to colleagues that the anomalies behaved like a living organism. In a private memo later recovered by the National Archives, he wrote, "It isn't mineral, it isn't gas. It's growing. And it's listening through the soil." After the war, the hollow map vanished. Only a single microfilm copy survived, hidden in a private collection until the 1980s, when an amateur historian named Margaret Tooley stumbled across it while researching abandoned government projects. Her copy shows one final annotation scrawled across the margin in red pencil. "Core origin, Cunningham, PA do not excavate." No one ever found out who signed it out or where it went. The county sealed the area once more. Bulldozers covered the foundation, and official maps quietly removed all mention of Buried Man's Hollow. But some residents still remember that spring, the smell of wet earth, and the quiet pulsing sound they swore came from beneath the flooded ground, like something breathing through the mud. And they'll tell you, whatever the Cunninghams awakened in 1879, it was never buried deep enough. By the 1970s, Buried Man's Hollow was no longer marked on any official Pennsylvania map. The forest had reclaimed the clearing, and the few locals who still remembered the name refused to speak it aloud. Yet for a small group of independent researchers from Harrisburg, the legend of the Cunningham family was precisely the kind of story they were looking for. The group called themselves the Appalachian Anomalous Research Team, 5 graduate students and 1 professor of anthropology, Dr. Leonard Hale. Their goal was simple: to document folklore and local hauntings across the Appalachian corridor using the latest field equipment, high-sensitivity microphones, magnetic tape recorders, and seismic sensors. In the summer of 1971, Hale's team arrived in Clearfield County. They interviewed locals, including an elderly farmer named Maeve Dobbins, granddaughter of the same deputy who had discovered the Cunningham cellar nearly a century earlier. She told them plainly, "You won't hear ghosts in that ground, you'll hear what they left behind." The team set up camp near the overgrown clearing and began nightly audio recordings. For 3 nights, they captured nothing unusual, just wind, insects, and the slow shifting of trees. But on the 4th night, around 2:37 a.m., the reel-to-reel recorder picked up a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse. 3 beats. Pausa. 3 beats again, almost like breathing through damp cloth. They assumed it was mechanical interference, until one of the microphones, buried several inches in the soil, began transmitting something else. A voice. Distorted, faint, but undeniably human. The transcript, later verified by a sound analyst from Penn State, read only, indistinct whispering, "Where's father? Can't breathe. Not done yet." The next morning, one of the students, 22-year-old Philip Crane, was missing. His tent remained zipped, his boots gone. Only his tape recorder lay outside, half buried in the mud. The last 2 minutes of the recording captured what experts later described as subterranean percussive movement, followed by a single human scream that cuts off mid-breath. The police searched for 2 weeks. No trace of Crane was ever found. The recovered reels. In 1982, more than a decade later, 3 unmarked boxes appeared in the basement inventory of the Clearfield County Historical Society. Inside were the missing tapes from Hale's 1971 expedition, along with personal notes from Dr. Hale himself. One entry, dated November 3, 1973, reads, "The breathing isn't from beneath the ground, it's from inside it. The soil is hollow. Something moves within, like lungs expanding. We are standing on something alive." The recordings were sealed by the Society under direction of the state coroner's office. Publicly, the reels were described as damaged audio material of no historical value. Privately, they were sent to the University of Pittsburgh for acoustic analysis. Only one researcher ever published findings, Dr. Miriam Adler, in a paper that was quietly withdrawn before journal release. Her conclusion: the waveform is consistent not with animal respiration, but with geological vibration, the rhythm of a cavity under tension, as if the ground itself were pulsing. Adler disappeared 6 months later while hiking near Parker Dam, 20 miles from the old Cunningham property. Her car was found at the trailhead. The soil around the driver's side door was freshly disturbed, soft and wet, though it hadn't rained in days. The last tape. The final tape in the recovered set is blank for 31 minutes. Then, faintly, a single phrase emerges through the static, whispered, almost gentle.
"You finally heard me." By 1958, Margaret Tooley, a librarian and amateur historian from Harrisburg, had spent nearly 15 years piecing together fragments of government archives connected to the hollow map. She wasn't a conspiracy theorist or a scientist, just a meticulous researcher who loved forgotten records. But her quiet curiosity would mark the last time anyone outside official channels would openly study the Cunningham phenomenon. She first noticed the anomalies in May. Her typewriter began misfiring, keys sticking, ribbons snapping, whenever she tried to transcribe certain coordinates from the microfilm. When she switched to longhand, her fountain pen leaked in precise intervals, leaving perfect rings of ink across the paper. Then came the vibrations. Every night around 2:17 a.m., her house trembled. Not enough to cause damage, just enough to rattle dishes and hum through the walls. The neighbors never felt it. Geologists found no fault line nearby. Margaret kept detailed logs. In one entry, dated June 3, 1958, she wrote, "The noise comes like distant thunder, but from below. Each tremor matches the coordinates on the hollow map, shifting east, just as Fenwick described. It feels as though the ground beneath me is breathing." Later entries grew erratic, written in shorter sentences. Lights under the floor. Soil moved in the cellar. Heard my name through the vent. By late summer, her notes stopped abruptly. When local authorities entered her home that autumn, they found everything untouched. Teacup on the table, lamp still on, curtains drawn. The only disturbance was in the cellar, where the dirt floor appeared to have subsided several inches, forming a shallow, perfect circle 6 feet wide. Margaret Tooley was never found. When the Bureau filed its report, they listed the cause as voluntary disappearance. But the microfilm she'd been studying, her only copy of the hollow map, was missing from its case. In its place lay a single sheet of paper. On it, written in typewriter ink too fresh to match her old machine, was a single line. The roots are patient. By the turn of the century, the Cunningham homestead was no longer a home, but a scar in the landscape. The farmhouse had collapsed in on itself, leaving a skeleton of gray boards and rusted nails. Locals avoided the area, claiming that the ground itself breathed in winter, small pockets of air escaping from the frozen earth like the size of something trapped beneath. In 1901, a new land survey was conducted in Clearfield County. The crew that stumbled across the old Cunningham property reported strange findings: shallow depressions where the ground should have been solid, and beneath them, layers of soil that appeared, turned, and replaced multiple times. The lead surveyor, Thomas Klein, later wrote in his journal that the site felt wrong, as if the earth resisted being measured. Soon after, the folklore began to resurface. Miners in nearby Phillipsburg whispered that they heard knocking beneath the hills, the same hills once connected to the Cunningham land. Children dared each other to walk the old wagon road at night, claiming a voice would call their name from underfoot. In 1924, a graduate student from the University of Pennsylvania named Dr. Helen Braddock visited the region to study rural isolation and degenerative inheritance, an early eugenics-era fascination. But what she found there was something no academic framework could explain. Locals told her that every few years, the ground behind the old house shifted. No animals would graze there. Metal tools left overnight would rust completely by morning. Dr. Braddock's notes, preserved in the university archives, mention a recurring dream she began to have during her stay, of hands pressing up from the soil, not in desperation, but in offering. When she returned to Philadelphia, she fell ill with what her colleagues described as nervous exhaustion. Within a year, she disappeared. The Cunningham farm was condemned and reforested in the 1930s. Yet foresters say the new trees never grew straight, their trunks bent, always away from one particular spot, the place where the earth was once disturbed.
And even now, nearly a century later, hikers in Clearfield County still tell stories of the wind carrying a man's voice across the valley, a voice that doesn't beg for rescue, but warns the living not to dig too deep. By sunrise, the Cunningham property had fallen quiet again. The storm that raged through the night left a crust of ice over the trees, turning every branch into glass. No smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints marked the snow. For the next 3 days, no one in Clearfield County saw a living soul at the Cunningham place. Only the occasional flicker of lamplight deep in the woods suggested anyone remained inside. When the sheriff finally rode out there, he found the house as it would appear in every later report: door unlatched, table set for 4, plates still bearing the residue of an unfinished meal. In the corner stood 3 shovels, their blades newly cleaned. The cellar smelled of earth, damp, raw, and recent. It was in that silence, that vacuum of human sound, that the legend of the Cunningham curse began to take root. Some said the sons fled into the forests and were never seen again. Others whispered that they stayed, beneath the house, beneath the roots, and that the woods themselves had taken them. Years later, hunters would still avoid that hollow. Dogs refused to track there, and compasses spun without direction. On certain March nights, the ground seemed to breathe, pushing up small pockets of air that smelled faintly of iron and candle smoke. Whatever had happened in that house, whatever the sons had awakened, did not die with them. It lingered, in the soil, in the timber, in the stories told around Pennsylvania firesides for generations. The first written record after the event came from Deputy Marshal Edwin Vance, who was sent from Harrisburg the following spring to close the Cunningham file. His personal notebook, later recovered from an attic in Altoona, was not included in the official report. Vance was a pragmatic man, not easily swayed by folklore, yet his journal began to change after his 3rd night in Clearfield County. "The ground around that homestead feels wrong," he wrote on April 3rd. "Soft in places, it should be frozen. The air carries a smell, faint, metallic, but not blood, something older. When I stand near the well, my lantern dims as though the flame can't bear to stay lit." Vance spoke to the few neighbors willing to talk. One farmer swore he'd seen movement beneath the snow, like moles tunneling but larger, shifting paths that never surfaced. Another recalled hearing a woman's voice humming through the stovepipe, though the house had long since gone cold. By the end of that week, Vance stopped writing altogether. His final note was a single line, scrawled in haste. Whatever was buried here was not meant to stay underground. He vanished the same month. His horse was found 3 miles north, reins torn, saddle intact. The Bureau closed the file in June 1880, citing weather exposure and likely animal predation. The people of Clearfield County accepted that answer. But for decades afterward, when the wind blew across the old Cunningham fields, locals said it carried a low moan, like a voice calling from beneath the frost.
And in 1892, when surveyors tried to cut a new logging road through that same property, their axes struck something just beneath the surface. Not wood, not stone, but a dense layer of roots running in perfect concentric circles around the old foundation. No trees in Pennsylvania grow that way.
In early 2026, a video appeared on an encrypted forum known only to digital archivists and investigative journalists, a place where suppressed content sometimes resurfaces. The upload was titled simply USGS Anomaly 221C, Restricted Footage, Clearfield County Excavation. It was just 14 minutes long. The first 6 minutes were ordinary, time-stamped bodycam footage showing a small research crew in hazmat suits excavating a shallow depression in a Pennsylvania forest. The date overlay read June 12, 1984, decades before any digital device should have been capable of that level of fidelity. The researchers identified themselves as part of a joint U.S. Geological Survey and Army Corps of Engineers project investigating subterranean gas emissions. The audio is faint but intact. At the 6-minute mark, one of the men says something that freezes the group. The soil's breathing. Then the camera tilts downward, revealing the earth shifting in gentle waves, almost imperceptible at first, then rhythmic. A low hum fills the mic, subsonic, almost vocal. Instruments spike. One technician shouts, "There's movement at 8 feet." They dig faster. The soil turns damp, black, pulsing with condensation. Then a metallic sound. They've struck something. Not rock, not pipe. Something hollow. The crew pauses. The lead researcher, Dr. Marcus Ellery, orders everyone back. No contact until atmospheric readings confirm safety. But the youngest tech, visible only by his name tag, Harland, crouches closer, brushing away loose soil. He puts his ear near the hole. Then everything collapses. The camera jerks violently, the sound of rushing air, a guttural scream, the light flickering out. For 2 seconds, before the feed cuts, we see something impossible. A hand, pale and wet, pressing outward from the soil, but not emerging. The fingers bent the wrong way, jointed like roots. The feed ends with 3 words displayed across a black background. Project Cunningham terminated. The leak. Digital forensics experts who examined the file claim the video metadata is genuine, time-stamped in 1984, encoded in a proprietary U.S. military format long since discontinued. But no record of any Project Cunningham exists in official archives. When the footage began circulating in March 2026, links vanished within hours. One journalist who attempted to mirror it reported her server wiped as if overwritten by something alive. Within a week, her Reddit account began posting fragments of text she claimed not to have written. It still breathes. They never filled it in.
We're not supposed to dig. Her final post read only, "When the ground dreams, stay above it." The declassified memo.
In October 2026, a leaked Department of Energy memo surfaced through a whistleblower site.
The memo, heavily redacted, confirmed an excavation conducted near Phillipsburg, Clearfield County, on June 12, 1984, following reports of non-seismic subsoil motion.
The final line, the only one unredacted, reads,
"Containment successful. Secondary site established beneath reservoir. No further exhumations authorized."
The coordinates point to the Foster Reservoir, completed in 1985, its foundation poured directly over the original Cunningham property. If the leak is authentic, then what those farmers uncovered in 1879 was not the end of a nightmare, but the beginning of a containment. The government didn't bury Silas Cunningham's story. They buried what was left of him. And it's still there. Waiting under 12 million gallons of still, black water. By the spring of 2030, most people had forgotten about the Cunningham leak. The forest was gone, paved and flooded beneath Foster Reservoir for nearly half a century. But deep inside the internet's forgotten corners, a small collective of archivists calling themselves the Silent Earth Project refused to let it go. Their founder, journalist Ava Delmont, believed the reservoir wasn't built to supply water at all, but to seal something underneath. The return to Clearfield. On May 3, 2030, Delmont and 2 camera operators launched a small research boat onto the reservoir at 2:14 a.m. Their goal, drop hydrophones through the water and record any low-frequency resonance near the old Cunningham foundation line. The night was windless, the lake perfectly still. The team's body cams show condensation forming on the inside of their lenses, as if the air temperature had dropped several degrees. At 2:19 a.m., one hydrophone begins transmitting an irregular pattern, a slow pulse, 8 seconds apart.
Ava's voice, calm but nervous, narrates. The signal's organic. It's not mechanical, not seismic. It's rhythmic. The pulse speeds up, then stops. Silence for 12 seconds. Then a whisper comes through every channel simultaneously, not through water, not through radio, through the microphones themselves. A father should never wake. The crew freezes. One operator mutters that he hears something under the hull, like breathing against the metal. At 2:23 a.m., the boat begins to drift without wind. Ava looks overboard. The surface below her is rising, as if the reservoir itself were exhaling. The emergency call. At 2:25 a.m., a distress call is logged by the county sheriff's office. Only fragments were recovered from the transmission. Coming up from It's under the boat. He's still. The signal cut out. When rescue teams arrived 4 hours later, they found the craft adrift, empty. No sign of the crew. Just 3 hydrophones floating in a triangle formation, still transmitting. Each cable ended not in a microphone, but in roots, slick and pale, fused to the metal connectors. The final upload. 3 days later, Ava Delmont's private server activated automatically. It uploaded a single 3-minute file to her channel, titled Final Broadcast Foster Reservoir. The screen stays black the entire time. You only hear sound.
First, faint water movement.
Then a voice, hers, trembling. If you're hearing this, stay away from Clearfield. It's not water anymore. It's lungs. A deep inhalation follows, shaking the speakers. Then, softly, another voice beneath hers, older, familiar from the earliest recordings. Silas. The file ends with the same 3 beats first heard in 2013. 3 pulses. Pausa. 3 pulses again. Every mirror of the clip was taken down within hours. Government statements cited digital forgery. But hydrophone data from a university research boy 5 miles away registered identical rhythmic pressure changes at the exact timestamp of the broadcast. The ground beneath Foster Reservoir still moves, just slightly, every few hours. Like the slow, patient breathing of something that was never meant to wake.
By 2061, the world had adapted to silence. The pulses that once shook seismographs across continents had stopped, but the Earth hadn't gone still. It had gone different. The new soil. Farmers from Pennsylvania to Western Europe began reporting the same impossible phenomenon. Their fields were turning black, not from ash or oil, but from something living. Under microscopes, the new soil appeared laced with fibrous threads, faintly luminous under infrared light. The material replicated at a cellular level, forming intricate vein-like networks that moved moisture in deliberate patterns, as if the ground itself were irrigating its own body. Agricultural scientists called it carbon root substrate. Locals called it black breath. At first, it seemed a miracle. Crops grew twice as fast, drought regions bloomed, and the air smelled clean and metallic. Then the side effects came. Every 8.2 days, plants would sigh, expelling bursts of moist air through microscopic fissures in the soil. Animals that lived near these zones began to change. Their bones thickened. Their eyes darkened. And when they died, they didn't decay. They sank slowly into the earth, as though the planet was reclaiming what it had lent. The displacement. Cities near contaminated zones experienced a new kind of storm. Black dust, soft, magnetic, almost oily, fell like snow, coating everything in a thin, breathing film. Air filters clogged with living material that continued pulsing hours after removal. By midsummer, governments called for evacuations. But people who stayed behind claimed the air sounded alive. At night, they heard a low hum coming from the soil, almost like the echo of a heartbeat beneath their homes. In one transmission from a research base near the remains of Foster Reservoir, a technician whispered, "It's growing toward us, not outward. It wants the noise we make." Then the feed ended. The awakening of growth. Biologists noticed something even stranger. The black substrate wasn't spreading randomly. Satellite mapping revealed it expanding along old riverbeds, the same waterways that had reversed during the 2050 event. It was reconstructing the lost network of circulation. The planet was knitting itself back together. By December 2061, over 12% of the continental crust showed signs of organic resonance.
Earth's magnetic field began to oscillate, faintly in sync with the heartbeat frequency recorded a decade earlier. The planet was, in every measurable way, alive, no longer metaphorically, but biologically. And as temperatures dropped globally, scientists realized what was happening. The Earth was not dying. It was changing metabolism. At the end of that year, a new tremor rolled across the world, soft, deliberate, and not destructive. From Pennsylvania to Patagonia, sensors picked up the same vibration. 3 beats. Pausa. 3 beats again. A breathing pattern. The message was clear to anyone listening carefully enough.
The planet was no longer our home.
We were living inside something. By the spring of 1858, something inside the Cunningham farmhouse had begun to unravel. Neighbors, those few who still passed along the wagon road, remarked that Martha Cunningham had not been seen in months. Her garden, once neatly tended even in the family's poverty, had gone to seed. The hens wandered unsupervised, and the smoke that once rose daily from the chimney came only sporadically now, sometimes not at all.
When Wilhelm Hofmeister's wife, Greta, made the 2-mile walk to deliver a jar of rendered lard, she found the front door unlatched. The inside of the farmhouse was dim and foul-smelling, the air heavy with sickness. Silas sat in a chair beside the hearth, his face blank, as if he hadn't slept in days. The boys, Josiah, Caleb, and little Nehemiah, huddled together near the stairs, their clothes unwashed, their eyes hollow. Greta asked for Martha. Silas said only, "She's sleeping." His voice was flat, mechanical, as though the words came from someone else's mouth. Greta took a single step toward the bedroom door before Silas rose abruptly and blocked her path. His hands trembled, but his expression remained blank. She left without another word, walking back to her farm through the woods, praying under her breath. 2 days later, the sheriff arrived. Martha Cunningham was found in the back bedroom, already cold. Her body showed no clear injury, no bruising, no sign of struggle. The coroner's report, written in spidery ink, listed only failure to thrive and general wasting. But those who saw her whispered that she looked drained, her skin pale as wax, her eyes sunken deep in her skull, as if something had been pulled out of her rather than taken from her by illness. Silas was questioned briefly. His story never varied. Martha had taken sick in the winter, refused food, and died in her sleep. The doctor, already familiar with the family's history, accepted it with a weary shrug. There was no inquest, no further investigation. The burial took place behind the farmhouse, on a rise overlooking the creek. The 3 boys stood beside their father as he shoveled the last of the earth over their mother's grave. Witnesses said none of them wept. The youngest, Nehemiah, stared at the ground as if studying the soil itself, while Silas whispered words no one could understand, half prayer, half apology. From that day forward, the Cunninghams' contact with the outside world diminished to almost nothing. The curtains remained drawn, the road overgrown. Travelers reported seeing faint lights moving between the trees at night, lanterns swaying without sound. Sometimes they heard voices, 3 men and 1 much older, chanting in the darkness. Years later, when the sheriff's men returned to that property in 1879, after Silas's miraculous rescue, they found that same grave. The wooden cross had long since rotted away, but the soil above it was disturbed, as though someone had been digging there in the intervening years. What they discovered inside Martha Cunningham's grave would never be included in the official report. After the initial review, Dana Bell could have signed the release forms, labeled the Cunningham footage as inconclusive, and moved on. Instead, she began to keep a private log. Every entry started with the same line. 7 knocks. Pause. Auf der Tren. At first, she thought it was just the building. Old pipes expanding, neighbors moving furniture. But the rhythm was too deliberate. It followed her between rooms, and later, into her dreams. By day, Dana searched the archives for anything connected to Dr. Helen Braddock or the missing film crew. The University Records Department sent over scanned pages from Braddock's field journal. Most were routine field notes, but the final page had been torn and then taped back together. Across it, in heavy pencil, were 3 words. Soil transmits memory. The phrase lodged in Dana's mind. She began cross-referencing geological surveys of Clearfield County. That's when she found a single anomaly. A narrow seam of mineral deposits stretching from the old Cunningham farm toward the creek. Traces of carbonized organic matter arranged in branching, root-like patterns. Late one night, she brought the data up on her monitor, overlaying it with satellite imagery. The lines matched perfectly with local property boundaries, forming what looked less like natural growth and more like a map, an underground network linking old settlements, forgotten graves, and vanished homesteads. The knocks started again, faint but clear, from somewhere below the floor. When she tried to record them, nothing appeared on the audio track, only a low hum that made the waveform tremble.
Yet in the silence between pulses, a voice seemed to whisper behind her, "Listen, not look." She didn't tell anyone at work. Instead, she requested access to the physical tapes again, claiming she needed to verify metadata. Security footage later showed her wheeling the cart of reels into the private viewing room after midnight. The next morning, the lights in that room were still on. The door was locked from the inside. When the maintenance team forced it open, the room was empty. Just an overturned chair and a tape spinning endlessly in the playback deck, its label smudged with fingerprints. The recording on that reel ends with the same sound that began her notes. 7 knocks, a pause, 3, then silence. When Dana Bell vanished, protocol dictated a simple internal inquiry, but the archive board hesitated. The disappearance happened on state property. The tapes were government evidence. Within 48 hours, a joint investigation formed, local police, a geological consultant from Penn State, and one federal observer whose credentials were partly redacted. The viewing room was sealed off with yellow tape. Investigators noted that the temperature inside was 5 degrees cooler than the rest of the building. The tape deck still whirred. The last reel had worn itself thin, leaving faint white scratches where the magnetic coating had stripped away. The sound, when digitized, produced no recognizable speech, only irregular pulses that, when plotted, resembled seismic readings. Detective Elaine Marrow, who led the case, was pragmatic and skeptical. She requested all prior evidence connected to the Cunningham property and began to build a timeline. 1879. The burial case. 1901. De Survey Anomalies. 1924. Dr. Braddock's disappearance. 2003. The Lost Film Crew. 2021. Dana Bell. 5 disappearances, 1 location. Marrow visited Clearfield County herself in late November. The old road to the Cunningham farm was now little more than a trail lined with second-growth pine. The air was sharp with iron and sap. At the supposed center of the property, she found an unmarked depression, bare earth in the middle of frost-covered leaves. Her geologist companion drove a soil probe 6 feet down and retrieved a core sample. The lowest layer shimmered black, almost metallic. Back in the lab, they examined it under magnification. The sample wasn't stone. It was a dense weave of something fibrous, organic, fused together as if under pressure. Every strand carried the same spiral pattern found in human fingerprints. Marrow wrote in her preliminary report, "Composición unidentified. Behavior reactive to heat and frequency." When she played the digitized audio from Dana's final tape beside the sample, the fibers quivered. Just once, 7 pulses, pause, 3, and then lay still again. She didn't include that observation in the official file. Instead, she closed her notebook and said to her assistant, "Whatever this is, it started long before any of us. The ground's just remembering."
By the early 1990s, Buried Man's Hollow had all but disappeared from public memory, erased from maps, omitted from environmental reports, and listed under a new designation in state archives, Clearfield Survey Site 19A. Only a handful of people knew what the A stood for, anomalous. In 1991, a state-funded geological survey team from Penn State was contracted to conduct a soil density study across northern Pennsylvania. Their equipment included one of the first field-ready ground-penetrating radar, GPR systems, capable of imaging underground anomalies without excavation. When the scanners passed over the area formerly known as Buried Man's Hollow, the instruments registered something no one could explain. At a depth of roughly 12 feet, the radar returned movement. Not seismic tremors, not water. But oscillating voids, shifting pockets like lungs slowly expanding and contracting beneath the soil. The readings repeated for hours, always rhythmic, always centered on the same 40-square-foot section of Earth. When the data was reviewed in Harrisburg, one analyst wrote in the margin of his report, "Pattern resembles respiration rate of F sleeping adult." 2 days later, the entire section of data was blacked out by state order. The team's equipment was confiscated for recalibration, and Site 19A was placed under indefinite excavation ban due to soil instability and hazardous substructure gases. To whistleblower files. In 1998, a former field technician named Russell Hammond came forward with a set of photocopied logs he'd smuggled out before the ban. The logs contained thermal imaging charts showing faint heat signatures, not in the air, but radiating upward from underground. Hammond claimed the temperature differentials were consistent with organic metabolic heat. In an interview with the Pittsburgh Courier, he stated, "It wasn't gas, it wasn't magma. Something under that ground was giving off body heat, like it was alive, but buried too deep to die." 3 days after his statement, Hammond's home burned down in what was ruled an accidental electrical fire. No remains were ever recovered. The government's quiet interest.
Between 2001 and 2008, satellite imaging of Clearfield County revealed irregular subsidence patterns across a 3-mile radius surrounding the old Cunningham site. The ground appeared to rise and fall seasonally, not enough for the naked eye to notice, but measurable by radar. Independent geologists proposed several explanations: methane buildup, groundwater pressure, frost heave. But every one of those theories failed to account for the consistency of the rhythm, the timing of the swell and compression, which matched almost perfectly with a breathing cycle. In 2009, the U.S. Geological Survey officially restricted all drilling and excavation permits within a 2-mile radius of Site 19A. The official reason: risk of toxic subsurface gases and historic contamination. Unofficially, researchers began referring to the area by its old local name again, quietly, in whispers. Buried Men's Hollow. The last attempt. In 2012, a small team of independent documentarians tried to bypass the excavation ban. They brought drones, thermal cameras, and a seismic microphone array, technology far beyond what the 1970s researchers had. For 3 days, their sensors picked up faint rhythmic pulses emanating from the center of the hollow. On the 4th night, all 6 cameras went dark at once. Their audio continued recording for 12 minutes before cutting out. When the footage was recovered, only one frame stood out, a low aerial shot of the clearing moments before the blackout. In the center of the image, the ground appears slightly raised, a gentle mound that hadn't been there hours before. In the final seconds of static, a voice, distorted, calm, and close, can be heard on one of the recorders.
Don't dig. The footage was never released.
The excavation ban remains in place to this day. By 2013, Buried Man's Hollow was nothing more than a rumor, an old wives' tale buried under decades of bureaucracy and forest.
But then the internet found it.
It started with a video uploaded to YouTube on August 14, 2013, by a hiker using the handle Woodsleeper89. The 2-minute clip showed nothing remarkable, just the camera panning over a quiet clearing, cicadas buzzing, sunlight cutting through trees. But near the end, as the wind picks up, the camera dips toward the ground, and a low, rhythmic sound can be heard beneath the soil.
3 beats.
Pausa. 3 beats again. At first, viewers assumed it was staged, but when the uploader returned to the site days later, the ground where he'd been standing was sunken nearly a foot, and his microphone captured something faint, like a whisper under his own footsteps.
Still here.
The clip went viral, shared across Reddit and paranormal forums under the title, "The Ground That Breathes." Within a month, the forest was crawling with amateur investigators, drone pilots, ghost hunters, and thrill-seeking live streamers. Then people began disappearing again.
The drone incidents. In 2015, multiple drone operators reported losing signal when flying directly over the hollow.
Some drones crashed, others vanished entirely.
One recovered camera,
Found 300 yards from the site, contained corrupted footage, but one frame showed something strange, a perfectly round depression in the clearing center, pulsing outward like a heartbeat.
audio extracted from the drone's onboard mic revealed a human voice layered under wind distortion, repeating a single word.
Breathe. Experts dismissed it as pareidolia,
Humans hearing patterns in noise. But online sleuths noticed something else. Every time the hollow's location was discussed in forums, the coordinates were quietly deleted within hours. Posts vanished, threads locked, entire channels removed. The TikTok disappearances. Between 2019 and 2021, a new wave of explorers arrived, armed not with radar or notebooks but phones. Hashtags like Married Man Challenge and hashtag Cunningham Whisper trended briefly, each encouraging users to record the breath of the earth. Most clips were hoaxes, until one wasn't. In April 2020, 2 users, Deep Expedition and Brian Chase, streamed from the edge of the hollow. The footage is disjointed, panicked. One of them jokes, saying, "Hear that? It's like the ground snoring." The other laughs, then suddenly stops. The camera drops, tilting sideways. The soil in frame begins to move, not crumble, but shift, in slow, deliberate pulses. Something presses upward from beneath, almost forming the shape of a hand before sinking back into the dirt. The stream cuts out mid-frame. Neither user ever posted again. Local authorities searched the site after the clip went viral, but found no trace of either man. Only a shallow depression in the center of the clearing, freshly disturbed. Digital silence. By 2023, Buried Man's Hollow was effectively erased again. Search results were filtered, satellite imagery of the coordinates blurred. The U.S. Forestry Service declared the area a restricted ecological restoration zone. Still, fragments keep surfacing. An audio file sent anonymously to a Pennsylvania radio station in 2024. A grainy TikTok showing a mound breathing in time with the cameraman's heartbeat. And most unsettling of all, a deepfake of an old 1971 voice recording uploaded to a ghost archive in 2025 that sounds nothing like any of the researchers who were there. The voice is older, slower, calm. It says,
The ground remembers. It's just waiting for someone to listen again.
And if you play the recording backward, which countless viewers have tried, you can still hear the faint scratching sound that started it all.
The same clawing the farmers heard that cold morning in 1879.
The hollow never forgot.
It only waited.
Detective Elaine Marrow stayed on the case long after the official investigation closed. By early spring, she had built a small off-the-record partnership with Dr. Ethan Carr, an acoustic physicist from Penn State who had seen the soil samples under a microscope and refused to dismiss them as contamination. They conducted their first private test in a soundproof chamber, white walls, low light, and the samples sealed in a glass cylinder at the center of the room. Carr explained the idea in his clipped, precise tone. If it's reacting to frequencies, then we can map its resonance signature. Every material has one. They began with a sweep from 10 Hz upward, even bone. At 73 Hz, the fibers rippled, faintly, like hair underwater. At 104, they twisted inward, forming a spiral. Carr adjusted the amplitude, murmuring, "This shouldn't be possible." The sound wasn't audible in the room, but Marrow felt it in her ribs, a pulse that wasn't just heard but remembered. When the resonance peaked, the lights flickered. The waveform on the monitor formed a jagged outline, almost like handwriting. Carr slowed the playback and overlaid it with Braddock's surviving notes. The curves matched several characters from her field journal, scrawled phrases about root cognition and memory conduction. The implication hung between them. The soil wasn't inert, it was responding. Marrow asked, "What is it saying?" Carr hesitated. "If you translate the pattern phonetically," he trailed off, then showed her the screen. The software's best approximation was a short string of letters, Dana. They both went silent. Before Marrow could respond, the chamber sensors spiked. The temperature dropped 5 degrees, the glass fogged from within. Then the sample began to emit a low vibration, synchronized to the same rhythm. 7 pulses, pause, 3. Carr killed the power. The vibration stopped instantly. When they opened the chamber, the soil had hardened into a perfect spiral, its ridges as fine as fingerprints. Marrow sealed the sample in an evidence container, marking it EX30. Her handwritten note on the label read, "If memory lives in matter, what happens when it tries to speak back?" After the resonance test, Dr. Carr wanted to destroy the sample. Detective Marrow wanted to listen to it again. By April, they had moved the study off campus, to a disused Cold War monitoring station outside Altoona, its underground lab still wired for acoustic isolation. The space felt wrong. No windows, concrete walls, only the constant hum of fluorescent lights and the cold scent of metal dust. They set the hardened spiral on a stainless steel table. Around it, Carr positioned a circle of directional microphones, each one feeding into an old analog recorder rather than digital equipment. He said digital devices stutter when they pick up unregistered frequencies. Marrow asked quietly, "What if it doesn't want to be heard through machines?" Carr didn't answer. He just switched everything on. The first hours passed with nothing but the sound of airflow and the whir of the reels. At precisely 2:13 a.m., one of the meters spiked, just a flicker, and the oscillograph needle began to tremble in a rhythm they both recognized. 7 pulses, pausa, 3. Carr stared at the waveform. "It's not reacting to sound this time, it's initiating."
Then the speakers came alive, not with a voice, but with a texture. A low, granular murmur that seemed to press against the edges of hearing.
Marrow leaned forward, straining to catch a pattern. Beneath the static, there was cadence, syllables forming and collapsing.
Carr filtered the signal through a spectral analyzer. The computer parsed it into fragments of phonemes. The translation engine returned 3 words. Buried, beneath, us. The hum rose until the lights dimmed. Every metal surface in the room began to vibrate softly. On the table, the spiral shape flexed outward, slowly unfurling the way a fern opens to light. Marrow whispered, "It's listening back." Then the entire waveform dropped to 0. The hum ceased. Carr played the tape again. Nothing. No signal, no sound. The analog reels were blank, magnetic coating stripped clean. When they turned toward the sample, the spiral had split into 2 halves, perfectly mirrored, each side etched with what looked like fingerprints not matching either of theirs. Marrow closed her notebook. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's finished recording."
When the logging surveyors returned with tools to clear the Cunningham property in 1892, they expected to find nothing more than frost and limestone. Instead, their axes struck something that sounded hollow, like splitting wood underwater. Beneath the topsoil, they uncovered a web of roots, pale, fibrous, and impossibly dense. The network radiated outward from the house's foundation, spiraling like a snail shell. The strangest part was that no trees nearby matched them. The surrounding woods were oak and pine. These roots were something else, thinner, more sinewy, and warm to the touch, even in the dead of winter. The men cut a few segments and brought them to the foreman's tent. By morning, the pieces were gone. In their place lay only a residue, a thin gray film that flaked away like ash when touched. That discovery ended the logging project before it began. The company filed no public report. The men refused to return. Yet, 3 months later, strange things began happening in nearby fields. Corn wouldn't grow, wells turned sour. And in the center of each field appeared perfect rings of dark soil, no plant life within, as though the ground itself had exhaled something toxic. By 1901, the Pennsylvania Geological Society sent investigators to document the phenomenon. Their published notes mention geothermal inconsistencies and unidentified subterranean organic matter. Privately, however, the head geologist, Dr. Winslow Carr, wrote a letter to his colleague in Boston. "We are not dealing with geology. The roots are alive. They seem to move. Not quickly, not visibly, but between our visits, the formations change. The ground rearranges itself. There is something beneath that land trying to surface." He ended his letter with a line that later researchers found underlined 3 times. "It is as if the earth remembers what was buried." By 1912, the dark soil rings had begun appearing far beyond Pennsylvania. First in western New York, then down through Maryland, and even across the Ohio border. Each ring identical, a perfect circle, 15 to 20 feet wide, barren in the center, and lined by faint pale roots just beneath the surface. Farmers blamed it on disease. Preachers called it divine punishment. The newspapers called them the devil's crop circles, decades before the term would resurface for other phenomena. But in official records, the earliest confirmed link came from a botanist named Eleanor Greaves, who studied soil pathogens for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She was one of the few scientists willing to visit the sites herself. Her field journals, long thought lost, were found in 1957 in a sealed crate labeled Experimental Mycology, Restricted. Inside, she had written, "The barren circles are not dead zones. They are breathing zones. The soil composition changes daily, as though something beneath exhales carbon dioxide and draws oxygen back in through microscopic tunnels. I can hear faint popping sounds when I press my ear to the ground, like bubbles forming under pressure." A week later, she sent a final telegram to her supervisor in Washington. "Samples unstable, movement increasing. Request immediate removal from site." She never filed another report. Witnesses claimed that after she left the Pennsylvania field station, the ground itself buckled, a slow rising motion, as though something immense shifted just below the surface, before collapsing again with a sigh that scattered her equipment across the clearing. By winter, the circles spread to 18 separate counties. And then they stopped, overnight. Every trace of the roots, every anomaly, vanished from sight as if the earth had closed its mouth again. Locals said it was the land going back to sleep. But those who lived near the old Cunningham property told a different story, one that would reappear in the decades to come. They said the roots hadn't disappeared. They'd simply gone deeper. By 2042, Foster Reservoir had become a restricted ecological zone. No boats, no drones, no public access within 5 miles of the shoreline. The official reason, chemical contamination due to subsurface gas leaks. But people living in the nearby town of Cuylertown started reporting something no environmental report could explain. The ground, for miles around the reservoir, was warm. Not from geothermal activity, not from industry. Just warm. The unexplained heat. Satellite thermal imaging from March 2042 showed an oval-shaped heat bloom beneath the reservoir, approximately 2.3 kilometers wide, 50 meters deep. The heat wasn't dissipating, it was pulsing. It rose and fell in perfect 6-hour intervals, matching no known natural cycle. A team from the Pennsylvania Geological Institute, led by Dr. Ilara Cohn, obtained a covert sample from a feeder stream near the site. Her analysis detected a strange compound, organic in structure but not microbial. She described it in her report. The sample reacts to sound frequencies in the 18 to 20 Hz range. When exposed, it contracts. When silence is reintroduced, it expands. It's not bacteria. It's not algae. It's tissue. Her findings were buried before publication. 2 weeks later, she went missing.
Her office was sealed by Department of Water Management officials, a department that, according to state records, had been dissolved in 2029. The draining. In late August 2042, the reservoir began to fall, 2 inches per day at first, then accelerating. Officials blamed a structural failure in the dam wall, but footage captured by nearby residents told another story. The water wasn't leaking out. It was being pulled downward, spiraling in a slow, deliberate vortex near the center of the lake. One video shows birds circling above the whirlpool, drawn downward by unseen wind. At 2:14 a.m. on September 9th, a flash of light erupted from the surface, not from above, but from below. The sound that followed was low and resonant, shaking windows as far as 20 miles away. Seismic monitors recorded it as a pulse, not a quake, identical in rhythm to the patterns detected in 2030. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats again. Then silence. The aftermath. When daylight came, the reservoir was half empty. A black pit lay in the center, not mud, not silt, but something glossy, solid, and gently undulating.
By noon, officials arrived and declared an environmental lockdown. All public footage vanished within 48 hours.
Satellite data since that day shows the pit widening by half a meter each month, not collapsing, but opening. Underneath, the Earth's density readings have dropped to near zero, as if there's a void beneath the state of Pennsylvania. And yet, seismographs all across the eastern U.S. began to register faint rhythmic activity. Note random tremors. A pattern. Scientists initially dismissed it as data interference, until recordings from Chile, Finland, and Japan picked up the same frequency. A low breathing tone repeating every 8.2 seconds. All synchronized. Whatever woke beneath Foster Reservoir was no longer sleeping alone. By 2050, there was no denying it anymore. Something under the earth was moving, and it was no longer limited to Pennsylvania. Hydrologists in the Great Lakes region were the first to notice a strange anomaly. The flow direction of minor tributaries had begun to reverse, not permanently, but in cycles, as if the rivers were inhaling. At first, scientists blamed unstable magnetic fields or lunar interference.
But when video footage emerged of the Susquehanna River running upstream for nearly 6 minutes on June 14, 2050,
explanations collapsed. The water wasn't being pushed by weather. It was responding to something below. The global pulse. Within days, similar reports appeared worldwide.
The Amazon slowed to a standstill, the water vibrating like glass under a distant bass note.
In Iceland, geothermal vents began to exhale rhythmic bursts of steam, every 8.2 seconds, matching the pulse first recorded in 2042. Off the coast of Japan, sonar buoys detected low-frequency vibrations from beneath the Pacific Plate, forming a perfect triangle pointing towards North America. Each pulse was the same frequency. Each pulse was growing stronger.
The International Geological Union called an emergency summit in Geneva. A classified briefing leaked afterward described the planet's crust as behaving like a respiratory membrane. A line from the report read simply, "The Earth is not cracking, it is flexing." The Pennsylvania breach. Meanwhile, back in Clearfield County, Foster Reservoir was gone, drained completely into a single circular pit, nearly a kilometer wide. At night, residents reported hearing something like wind under the ground. Thermal scans showed the void glowing faintly from within, not heat, but bioluminescence. Like the shimmer of deep-sea organisms. A remote camera drone sent down into the cavity transmitted for exactly 22 seconds before signal loss. The footage showed what looked like an organic surface, textured like pale skin, covered in what geologists first assumed were cracks. But as the drone approached, those cracks opened. They were pores. And they were breathing. The reversal event. At 4:17 a.m. July 2nd, 2050, every body of water within 500 miles of the site began to reverse course.
Streams surged uphill. Rivers looped backward.
The Delaware and Potomac both receded from their banks, flowing inland. Sensors placed in the pit
recorded an immense pressure wave, not gas, not heat.
A heartbeat. Measured at roughly 38 beats per minute. The resonance was powerful enough to cause ground liquefaction in neighboring states.
Buildings swayed. Glass shattered as far away as Boston. Then, at the exact moment the pulse reached its peak, the global tremor frequency vanished.
For the first time in nearly 2 decades,
silence.
For 6 full minutes,
the world held its breath. And then, from every seismic monitor still running, a single word emerged through crosswave distortion, a sound not made by machine or nature, but voice. Up. The ocean surged inland by less than an inch. Just enough to remind humanity that the thing below was awake and listening.
When the sheriff's men began to turn the earth over Martha Cunningham's grave in the spring of 1879, the morning fog hung so thick across the property that the farmhouse looked like a ghost itself, gray timber dissolving into mist. They had already unearthed one horror that week: Silas Cunningham, alive after being buried 4 feet under the ground by his own sons. He had spoken haltingly of punishment, of his children's judgment, and of sins that stretched back generations. But when he mentioned the grave behind the house, his voice had cracked into a trembling whisper. The sheriff, Amos Dwyer, a practical man hardened by 30 years of frontier justice, had assumed the old farmer was delirious. But he ordered the site dug anyway, partly to placate the terrified rescuers who refused to set foot near the house without seeing what lay beneath. By noon, the men reached the coffin. It was crude, 4 mismatched planks nailed together, the wood swollen with 20 years of moisture. When they pried the lid loose, a foul vapor burst forth, a wet earthen stench mingled with something sharp and metallic. Inside lay not one body, but 2. The first was clearly Martha Cunningham, her skeletal form still wrapped in the remnants of a burial gown, but clutched tightly against her chest, almost fused to her ribcage, was a much smaller skeleton, the tiny bones of a child. There were no records of another birth on the Cunningham farm after Nehemiah. No christening, no grave marker, no mention in any parish book. The men stepped back in horror, yet the evidence lay there in the coffin. A child perhaps 1 or 2 years old, buried in secret with its mother. One of them, a young deputy named Carter, vomited into the grass. Another crossed himself again and again, muttering that the devil walked in that soil. Sheriff Dwyer ordered the remains left as they were until a doctor could examine them. But the night after that exhumation, something happened that ended the investigation entirely. By morning, the open grave was empty. Both bodies, Martha's and the child's, had vanished. The disturbed earth showed no tracks, no signs of theft, no animals, no footprints. Only the imprint of the coffin itself remained, a dark hollow in the mud, and a faint, unnatural warmth radiating from the soil as though the ground itself had drawn them back. When questioned, Silas refused to speak. He sat staring at the window of his hospital room, repeating a single phrase over and over, the same one the doctors eventually recorded in his statement. "She took what was hers, and the ground keeps the rest."
That night, the sheriff sealed the property. None of the deputies would return, and when the county surveyors mapped the area a decade later, they found the Cunningham homestead missing from the official records, as if it had been erased. Only one thing remained certain. Whatever the Cunningham sons had uncovered in that house before turning on their father, it had already been awake for years. What happened inside the Cunningham farmhouse on the night of March 10, 1879, has never been officially recorded in any legal transcript. The details that survived come from fragments of Silas's testimony, from the burnt pages of the sheriff's confiscated notes, and from what a neighbor later swore he saw through the trees. The Cunningham house by then had already become something more than a dwelling. Years of rot and silence had turned it into a kind of organism, wood swollen with damp breath, its beams sighing in the night wind like ribs. When the fire in the hearth died down, the walls themselves seemed to exhale, timbers flexing in ways that sounded almost alive.
That evening, as a blizzard built over the Allegheny Plateau, Silas sat alone at the kitchen table. The 3 sons were upstairs.
He could hear them moving, deliberate heavy footfalls above him, and the scrape of furniture being dragged across the floorboards. He assumed they were blocking the windows again, trying to keep out the cold. Then came the voices.
But the sounds continued for hours, rhythmic and precise.
Note conversation, chanting. 3 voices rising and falling together in a cadence Silas didn't recognize. The words were thick, guttural, distorted by the low ceilings and the weight of the storm. He thought at first it was some childish mimicry of the hymns Martha had once sung. But the longer it went on, the more wrong it sounded. There was no melody, no recognizable language, just repetition, like the grinding of millstones. When the chanting stopped, silence fell so completely that even the storm seemed to pause outside. Then from above came a soft dragging sound, something being pulled across the floor, then bumped down each stair, one by one. Silas rose, lantern in hand. At the foot of the staircase lay a bundle wrapped in a quilt. The shape was small, human-shaped, but stiff. One of the sons, Josiah the eldest, stood behind it, face expressionless. His eyes reflected the lamplight in a pale, watery shimmer. "What's that?" Silas asked. Josiah didn't answer. Behind him, Caleb and Nehemiah appeared, each carrying a second bundle, smaller still. They laid them in a row before the hearth. Silas moved closer, pulling back one corner of the fabric, and froze. Inside were bones, small ones, delicate as kindling. He recognized the fragments instantly. He had buried those bones himself, years ago, when Martha died. The children's remains. The sons had dug up the graves. When Silas staggered back, speechless, Nehemiah finally spoke. His voice was calm, eerily steady.
"She called to us, said you'd hidden them, said they were waiting."
Then the smell hit him. Damp soil, old decay, and something else beneath it, something almost sweet. The air in the room shifted. The walls seemed to creak inward, like the house was listening.
Silas tried to shout, to demand they stop, but the words failed. He realized, with a sudden animal terror, that the house had gone utterly still. No wind, no fire, only the sound of breathing, his and theirs, and something deeper, coming from the floorboards themselves. That was the night the sons decided their father had to die, not out of rage or revenge, but because they believed they were carrying out an instruction. By dawn, they began digging the pit. And in the hours before they put their father into the ground, the neighbors swore they saw 4 figures in the snow, not 3, standing in a circle behind the Cunningham house, their shadows long and unmoving in the pale morning light. In the autumn of 2003, a small independent film crew arrived in Clearfield County to shoot what they called the Cunningham Tapes, a low-budget documentary about forgotten Appalachian legends. They were young, idealistic, and freshly graduated from a Pennsylvania film program. 5 friends chasing a viral story before that term even meant anything. Their project's focus had been ghost stories and unsolved disappearances, but when they stopped for gas outside Filmsburg, the station attendant asked where they were headed. When they told him, he went quiet, then muttered, "Don't go digging near the creek. De Grant, don't forget." That sentence became the tagline of their film. The crew set up camp about half a mile from the old Cunningham property, in the woods where the wagon road once cut through. Their first nights were uneventful, just the usual hum of insects and the occasional passing deer. But on the third night, the camera's sound operator, Leo, recorded a low rhythmic thumping under the ground. He thought it was the generator misfiring until they played it back. 7 slow beats, a pause, then 3, almost like knocking. When they checked the equipment, everything was clean. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was coming from the ground itself. Over the next 2 days, the team began to experience subtle changes in their environment. The temperature near the supposed grave site was consistently colder than the surrounding woods. A compass spun uselessly when held above a patch of soil near the creek. Their lead researcher, Maya Leyland, grew obsessed. She discovered that county archives contained only partial records of the original Cunningham case, but she also found a box labeled Braddock, H. 1924, Field Notes, Restricted. The same Dr. Braddock who had disappeared 80 years earlier. Inside were sketches, the outline of a human figure beneath cross-sections of soil, surrounded by what she described as calcified roots. On camera, Maya said something that still sends shivers through those who've seen the recovered footage. What if the story was never about death? What if it's about transformation, about the earth taking back what it's been given? The next evening, a storm rolled in. The crew retreated into their tents. Their last recorded footage was a handheld shot of rain hitting the tarp, and a single, distinct voice captured beneath the thunder. A man's voice, faint but clear, saying, "Not again." When authorities arrived days later, the campsite was empty. Cameras were found, footage intact, but no sign of the 5 filmmakers was ever discovered. The police report filed after the 2003 disappearance listed the case as unresolved wilderness exposure, but the box of tapes recovered from the site told a different story. The footage, 26 hours of digital and high-8 recordings, was transferred to the county evidence archive. For almost 20 years it sat untouched, logged under unidentified film material. In 2021, during a routine digitization project, archivist Dana Bell reopened the file. The tapes began like any student documentary. Drone shots of forest, interviews with locals, shaky handhelds of crumbling chimneys and stone foundations. The early reels were almost banal, until timestamp 3 hours 17 minutes and 42 seconds on tape 12. The camera is facing Maya. She's kneeling beside the creek bed, soil dark beneath her nails. The microphone picks up faint tapping under the water. She looks up and says quietly, "It's hollow." The next cut, likely filmed hours later, shows the team lowering a small camera into a narrow pit. The video quality breaks down into static, then light flares across something pale beneath the soil, tree roots that seem to twist in deliberate shapes. One, unmistakably, forms the outline of a hand. From this point, the footage fragments,
Tape 14 shows Leo arguing with someone off-screen about turning it back. Tape 15 captures the group at night, their floodlights flickering, while Maya reads Braddock's notes aloud. The roots remember what the flesh forgets. Tape 16 is almost entirely black. Only sound remains: wind, rain, and what might be shallow breathing close to the microphone. When Dana Bell screened the tapes in the archive's viewing room, several technicians refused to finish. They said the audio carried an infrasound tone, below human hearing, but strong enough to make their chests vibrate. Later analysis found no such frequency. The last frame of the final tape is a still image, the camera pointing up from ground level, raindrops striking the lens. For a split second, a figure appears at the edge of the frame, not standing, but emerging from the soil, its outline blurred by motion. Then the tape ends. Bell's official report concluded: content anomalous, no edits detected, environmental cause undetermined. But unofficially, she told a colleague that after viewing the footage, she began hearing that same knocking in her apartment walls. 7 beats, a pause, then 3.
In the weeks following the discovery of the Cunningham farm, Clearfield County tried desperately to move on. The sheriff's men burned the farmhouse to its foundations, the ash mingling with the thawing snow of early spring. The remains of Caleb and Josiah were buried in unmarked graves on county land, their coffins nailed shut at the insistence of Reverend Billings, who claimed, "Some bloodlines need no resurrection come judgment." Silas himself never recovered. The ordeal left him frail, half-mad, a man who mumbled to himself about roots and voices in the cellar. He was committed to the Belafonte Asylum in August of 1879, where he died less than a year later from pneumonia. The only words he spoke clearly in his final days were recorded by a nurse. "He's still in the trees. The youngest. He learned to live in the dark before the rest of us did." Those words, dismissed as the ramblings of a dying mind, would take on new weight as the years went by. Because the story of Nehemiah Cunningham did not end in 1879. The sightings begin. In 1881, a group of loggers working west of Phillipsburg reported strange activity in the woods, missing tools, torn camp tents, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. One man claimed to have seen a figure crouched in the tree line at dusk, small, barefoot, dressed in rags, its skin gray with dirt. When they approached, it fled silently into the underbrush on all fours. Sheriff Trowbridge, still in office, organized another search. They found nothing, but the men reported something far more disturbing: small traps made from twine and bone scattered throughout the forest. Inside one of the traps was a bird skull, arranged alongside symbols identical to those once drawn on the walls of the Cunningham cellar. By the mid-1880s, hunters and travelers began referring to the woods around the old Cunningham property as the Buried Man's Hollow. Livestock disappeared, and stories spread of fires burning deep in the timber at night, faint flickering lights that moved against the wind. In 1887, a pair of teenage brothers, the McAfees, vanished while walking home from a barn dance in nearby Carthouse. Their bodies were found days later in the creek bed below what had been the Cunningham property. Both boys had been strangled, their faces pressed into the mud. One had a crude cross carved into his chest, backward. The sheriff at the time, Thomas Harlan, reopened the Cunningham file. He examined the sealed testimony from 1879, reading Silas's words about the voice in the ground and the roots that spoke through Nehemiah. Within weeks, Harlan resigned, citing poor health. His replacement sealed the records again. But the stories didn't stop. The hollow that wouldn't die. By the 1890s, the Cunningham property was long gone, overgrown, reclaimed by forest. The creek shifted course, flooding the old burial site, and the last visible traces of the farm vanished beneath moss and pine needles. Yet people kept hearing the same sound. A muffled pounding beneath their feet when the soil was soft after rain, faint scratching like fingernails against wood, and in rare terrifying moments, a human voice calling a single word through the earth. Father. Local children dared each other to visit the site, though most never went beyond the edge of the clearing. Those who did often returned sick, dizzy, pale, unable to sleep for days. One boy in 1896 was found digging in his own yard, saying he could hear someone whispering under the dirt. To this day, no record ever confirmed the death of Nehemiah Cunningham. No grava, no bones, no proof. Only stories, whispered for generations in Clearfield County about the man who learned to live in the soil, who believed redemption came not from heaven, but from below. And when the wind passes through those trees just right, it said you can still hear his breath under the roots, steady, patient, waiting for the ground to soften again.
For half a century, the story of Silas Cunningham and his vanished sons lived on only in whispers, the kind of tale old men told over whiskey to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But in the spring of 1930, the legend stirred again.
The Civilian Conservation Corps, one of Roosevelt's New Deal programs, had begun clearing old farmland for reforestation near Clearfield County. One of the assigned parcels was a stretch of wilderness known locally as Buried Man's Hollow. To the men on the project, it was just another patch of overgrown timber. To the locals, it was cursed ground. The crew foreman, Charles Red McIntyre, later gave a sworn statement describing what happened on the third week of work. While cutting drainage trenches near a creek bed, one of his men, Joseph Carter, struck something buried just below the surface, not rock but wood. They assumed it was part of an old fence post. When they dug deeper, they realized it wasn't.
It was a box, roughly the size of a small coffin. Inside, wrapped in rotted fabric and packed with soil, were bones, small, brittle, and arranged unnaturally, not laid to rest, but posed almost ritualistically. Among the remains were bits of rusted wire, fragments of twine, and what the coroner would later describe as primitive carvings on several of the ribs. The sheriff's office called in a local archaeologist from Penn State, Dr. Arthur Delaney. He examined the site and made a note in his field journal that wouldn't be made public until decades later. Bones note animal, possibly human, but stunted. Skull size inconsistent with known growth patterns. Marks of confinement visible, possibly buried alive. The work crew refused to return after that. Some claimed their tools went missing overnight. Others swore they heard voices when digging, faint, rhythmic tapping from underground. McIntyre himself said he saw something move beneath the soil, like an animal burrowing, but deeper, slower, as if dragging itself. By June of that year, the federal office ordered the site sealed and reclassified as unstable terrain. The official report listed the discovery as non-human remains, likely ceremonial or symbolic, but the locals knew better. They called it the Second Unearthing. The journal that shouldn't exist. In 1947, nearly 2 decades after the CCC incident, a private collector named Harold Baines purchased a lot of estate items at an auction in Belafonte. Among them was a water-damaged notebook labeled Property of Dr. A. Delaney, 1930 Field Study. Inside, written in spidery ink, was a single paragraph that Baines claimed changed his life. There was another voice when we dug, beneath us, not echoing but answering, as if something old and slow was listening. I dream now of roots moving like veins under glass. I cannot sleep near soil anymore. 2 months after making the journal public, Baines was found dead in his home, an apparent suicide. His fingernails were packed with dirt. The notebook disappeared soon after, taken by the coroner's office and never entered into the official record. The 1952 flood. Then, in 1952, a flood swept through Clearfield County after weeks of heavy rain. Locals reported hearing deep, resonant booms from underground before the first levee broke. When the waters receded, the old Cunningham site, long thought buried, had surfaced again. The remains of a foundation jutted from the mud like rotten teeth. And near the center of the clearing, rescuers found something impossible. A section of earth had collapsed inward, revealing a hollow space, a tunnel of packed soil running several yards underground. At the end of it lay a narrow pit lined with wood and old cloth. Inside, pressed into the dirt like a fossil, was a single human hand, pala, desiccated, perfectly preserved. The coroner, Dr. Paul Meredith, described it in his notes as not recent, but not entirely dead either. The tissue had the texture of something mummified by nature, not time. He ordered it transported to the county morgue. But when the specimen arrived the next morning, the jar was empty. Only soil remained.